Well, okay. Well, we'll start recording, okay, and get started. So thanks everyone for joining. I sent that invite out today on Facebook. When I did it last week, a few people seemed interested, which was nice. And then um, I figured let's set a time and try and have a nice conversation about some of this stuff. And then I put it up today, and then the response was really overwhelming. I spent a good chunk of the day going back and forth, cutting and pasting emails into an invite. So it was great. So I think we have 50 of like the 80 people who contacted me today here now, which is fantastic. And hopefully this recording will be successful, where we can share it later on if people who couldn't make it are still interested. But what I wanted to do today is really just take advantage of the community, right? We're around, we have so much downtime these days. Many of us are not working, and I think those of us who are working are probably working very part-time, seeing only a couple of patients with emergencies and so forth. So it's a great opportunity for us all to get together and talk about some of what we see and some of these important issues. I think when it comes to trauma, and in particular, when I use the word heart shock, we're not just talking about a traumatic event. We're talking about a trauma that has risen to the level of creating a systemic instability, right? So that's really the difference. A lot of people experience different types of traumas, injuries, accidents, and so forth. But what makes it something that rises to that level of heart shock and creates that systemic imbalance? And that really is dependent on so many factors. But I think a lot of us see this with our patients. A lot of us see this with our family. I think a lot of us are experiencing it ourselves in the crazy times that we're living in right now, and some of what we're going through as a collective community in terms of lockdown and the fear that's generated from some of the stuff we hear in the news and the illnesses that are going around can really spark heart shock in a lot of our patients and a lot of our friends and families, for sure, and even in ourselves potentially. So I really I thought it'd be a great time and opportunity for us all to get together and discuss some of those things, and what we're seeing, what to look for, how to manage it, and tap into that hive mind about what are the best strategies to really address it. So I don't really plan, this was never really planned for me to kind of go and have like this large lecture per se. I think many of you who are here today have been in some of my classes or seen some of my teachings or have seen the book, but many of you haven't. So I think everyone's at kind of a different place in terms of the teachings that I have put forth. So I really wanted to open it up as a discussion, and maybe open it up to some questions and see what people's experiences are in terms of what they're seeing clinically, what they're seeing themselves, what they've seen has worked for them in the past. And mostly what I'm interested in terms of the way I look at Chinese medicine is not so much this point, this treatment, this herb, this formula. I'm more concerned about process-oriented approaches. I want to make sure we understand theories of how we can apply this to our patients in any given situation and navigate fluidly from one patient to the next without feeling like, oh, this worked on one patient, why isn't it working on this patient? I'm doing the exact same points and they're both having heart shock, right? But of course, all these patients are managing their symptoms differently. The way they experience the world, the way they experience their illness is all unique to them. And that's part of this humanistic approach that we need to apply to our patients. So throughout tonight's discussion, I want to really just focus on that primarily, on the process of what we're looking at, on the strategies, on the thought process, and on the theoretical underpinnings of what we're trying to do for our patients who are coming in with a whole gamut of symptoms and signs, for heart shock. So does anyone have any particular question, issues that they're most interested, or do you want to share an experience that they have with their own patients or themselves? Because I'd love to be able to open it up, and you can just, unmute yourself, and we can go from there if you have something you want to ask or share. And if not, I thought we, at some point we would go through and really, I thought a focus on perhaps on the wood phase might be most appropriate for right now, if there are no real major questions or things that people want to start with, because I think when we're looking at the wood phase, we're talking, in many respects about stuckness, right? And we're all stuck right now. We're all trapped. We don't have a lot of options in terms of how we navigate our situation right now. We're kind of isolated. We're quarantined. We're trying to navigate this whole process, and I think many people can feel the intense, the severity of what that brings out in them and their patients and their families, right? I mean, isolation is a very interesting phenomenon, right? And we all, I think, need human contact and touch, right? And communication with our friends, our colleagues, our families to kind of feel okay. And when we're deprived of that, when it's taken away abruptly, it can create a whole host of interesting things in ourselves and in our patients. And I noticed that, around where I'm living right now, there is such an intense push to keep everyone in their homes. And, in my town, it's getting to the point where if people see you walking next to somebody and you don't seem to be that 6 feet apart, they're calling the police, right? And we just instituted something here in New Jersey where they've shut down the parks, the county parks, and some of the town parks are closed down too. So it's a really interesting thing, because last week when the sun was up, tons of people were walking around. I think everyone was doing it responsibly. They were maintaining social distance. They were with their family or friends and keeping apart from other people. But we see such an imposition right now of fear that some of it's internally generated, but I think a lot of it is coming from the exterior, right? And the way I look at that is an external pathogen, right? It's, it could initiate something internally, right? Or aggravate a pre-existing pathogen or underlying insufficiency or deficiency in terms of whether or not there's a general predisposition to fear. But it's coming so strongly from the exterior that we really need some type of barrier to or way of navigating that intense resistance to our own drive to be with other people and to achieve and grow and evolve, right? So right now it feels like people aren't given that opportunity. So I think the wood phase right now is really being stunted. And it's interesting because we are in the emergence of spring right now, right? And so how does that impact our own physiology, right? As we're supposed to be mimicking the energetics of nature, right? As the microcosm to the macro. And so are people showing up with different types of ailments as a result of the inhibition of their own wood from emerging at this time, right? So does anyone have any comments about that? Are you seeing anything like that in your own practices, or, I mean, if you're seeing patients or in your own experience of your communications with family or friends? You can unmute yourself and jump in.
Everyone's pissed off, frustrated. That's obvious.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For sure. And how are you managing that in people? Do you see that as a normal response or a distortion?
Given what's going on, I think it's a normal response. I do think it's intense, and I'm not sure how people are managing, because I get emails or calls, and people are just like, ugh, like visibly, and they say it. Like they're like, oh, it sucks. I can't get in for acupuncture, or, I'm tired of being claustrophobic, or even my sister-in-law, I talk to her every day because I live alone, and she's just pissed off. I can tell. And I was like, wow, it's intense. Yeah,
for sure. Anyone else? I mean, one of the things that we start to see is that, from a heart shock perspective, we can start to see an exacerbation of the rough vibration on people's pulses when because the wood phase is something where it's we know that wood has an ascending energetic to it, right? So when we can experience something like heart shock on a chronic basis, and we learn to adapt to that nature of shock and trauma, we can slow down the progression of symptoms that we might be experiencing, until you do something where you block a naturally emergent energetic, right? And then you start to get a big forceful movement in that direction, because anytime you create stagnation, you create heat as an impulse to move against that stagnant force, right? And so as that starts to happen, what you might find is that a pulse starts to pound more forcefully, right? You might start to see energy from the deeper levels of the pulse, like the organ depth and the blood depth, start to emerge up into the chi depth of the pulse, right? And so you may start to see now an emergence of increased rough vibration on the pulse, which is one of those pathognomonic findings of trauma. You also may start to see an increase in speed on the pulse from the heat that's being generated, right? Wood is a yang phase, right? And it's about movement, right? And so as we start to create that stagnation and the pounding that comes off of that stagnation, we start to see an elevation in heart rate at the same time, right? Because with the liver and the gallbladder are always have their eye on something ahead of them, right? It's about planning, it's about moving, it's about decision making, right? So it's about the emergence of something and the movement towards a particular goal. And so when we feel stunted from that, that can rise very much to the surface and create a lot of surface tension. We can see armoring, we can see all different types of musculoskeletal symptoms show up at the same time, right? We may see a different type of focus or intensity in the eyes, right? And red eyes and all the things that would go along with, like the wind heat symptoms that one gets during allergy time in the spring, right? We see an increase in things like hypervigilance, right? And obsessive compulsive behavior to start to move towards a goal in a way where we're being prevented from doing so, right? So, one of the things that we see a lot of in wood phase is this idea of a management and a modulation of advance and retreat, right? Dr. Hammer talks about this in his book all the time. And so we have to know when it's appropriate to sit back and relax, gather our forces, regenerate, right? Replenish, versus moving out in the world and trying to achieve our goals, right? And so oftentimes when the person is deficient, that capacity to modulate that distinction gets impaired, right? And so then you throw in, which I think most people have to a large degree. I think probably it is a very large percentage of people, and I think Brant would probably agree with this, that show up with this liver yin deficient presentation, right? Where, it's very hard to back down from something. They're generally not people who are too aggressive until they feel threatened, and then they become very aggressive, right? And so all of a sudden you're moving along in your life, and you're trying to embody this kind of flexibility and adaptive response that is so part of the gallbladder and wood phase energetics, and then all of a sudden you're told, no, you can't, you're stunted, right? And so this can create a significant amount of tension and blockage and heat and inflammation, right? That can come out in incredibly distorted and improper or potentially dangerous and violent ways, right? And for sure, in some type of aggressive behavior, right? And so it's really important to be mindful of that. And I think we're seeing a lot of that during this time. And I think it's one of the reasons why when you look out in the way people respond to other people who aren't social distancing or doing what you believe to be proper or ethical types of behavior, it doesn't get met with, just turning the other cheek. It gets met with a certain vehemence, right? And a certain aggressiveness that can become quite problematic, right? I mean, it's one thing to work towards a particular goal. It's another thing to be aggressively forcing other people to live in a particular way, right?
Do you think this means, with the liver cheese nation being so intense and it being spring, do you think the next step is going to be spleen chi deficiency and heart blood? Like, what should we anticipate with our patients when we come back to work from
Yeah,
all of
I
this?
mean,
Because everyone's surprised.
yeah, I don't think there's one particular answer to that. I think, and I'm open to, hear what other people think as well, but I think we have to be aware, again, we're talking about process, right? So process relies on multiple things. Every organ system, every channel system is intercommunicating and reliant on the others. And that's going to be different for everyone based on their own constitution, right? And so one of the things we're always looking at is the stress that's being imposed on someone and the terrain or the landscape or the constitution that imposition is on, right? So many people are going to manage that in myriad ways depending on those capabilities. Am I freezing up? Did I freeze up there for a second? No? Okay, good. Just on my computer. So I think I wouldn't expect anything from your patients necessarily unless you already have a great understanding of their constitutions and how they tend to react to different circumstances, right? That's one of the things that we do, in Chinese medicine as an assessment. The first time we're looking at someone, we're taking their pulse, we're doing all the questions and the systems and everything else, and looking at the tongue and the complexion and all the other things that you would come to understand your patient's physiology and how they manifest that in the world. And then from there, we should have a really good understanding of how they're going to react based off of exposure to A, B, C, D, or E, right? So I don't think it's a particular any one-to-one correlation there. But
Ross, I have a question.
yeah.
With everything happening in regards to the situation right now, and for those of us who are not practicing, those of us who are, there's, from what I'm seeing, a lot of pericardial involvement in the heart shock, and like having chest pain or, rib pain, or in the upper kidney points, a lot of pain up here. And being that this is a virus that's affecting the lungs primarily, and the root of it being a lot of fear going on right now, I wanted to talk about the association between the kidney and the lung, and then the Jue Yin aspect of the wood and pericardium relationships, if people are seeing any of that come up in their practice right now. I don't know if that makes sense the way I'm saying that. It's kind of an unformed thought.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, for those of you who are seeing patients, does anyone want to jump in? Lily, you can turn on your mic.
Hello.
Hey.
I'm not actually seeing patients. I'm just talking to a lot of patients on the phone and emailing with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just, the theme I'm seeing, and I think it's related to pericardium, just chest, but so much grief. And I think it's also interesting, like it's this time that on the surface looks, we're in spring, but we're also all retreated and sheltering at home. And so there's this sort of surface, what looks like yin time on the surface of everybody kind of being retreated and still, but there's just this like nervous system revving. It's like a car that's in neutral, but the foot's all the way on the gas. So a lot of that kind of sort of stillness on the surface, but a lot of revving inside. And then I'm just hearing a lot of grief, and I feel like it's partly collective grief, not just individual grief, and sort of the anticipation of grief, like being in that sense of, all that we've sort of the loss of life as we know it, but also the anticipation, and there's fear in that obviously, but like the anticipation of impending grief. So I'm seeing, people are reporting just so much tightness in the chest and difficulty, breathing and catching a breath
Yeah.
and a hypervigilance about, I mean, everybody's so hyper aware of every little thing they're feeling in their lungs right now. Plus it's springtime. Right.
Well, right. The emergence of allergy symptoms is there, and of course that's bringing the tickle to people's throats and the tearing of their eyes and all the different things that people show up with, right? But I do think you're right. The nervous systems are being challenged for sure right now, and I think when we're talking about the nervous system, I think we need to clarify what that is a little bit, right? Because it's not really a Chinese medicine term, right? It's a term that Dr. Shen used and Dr. Hammer used, and I've spent a good amount of time trying to define what that really means, because I think we throw that term around really loosely all the time, right? Oh, we're tense, our nervous systems are tweaked, or is it the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system? Like, what are we really talking about, right? But to break that down, if we look at the nervous system in general, one of the things that Dr. Shen spoke about was that the nervous system dealt with the Taiyang and the fastest moving energies, right? So we can take that and say, well, that's really a reflection of the energetics of Wei Qi, right? And looking at the surface and the Taiyang and how it expresses to the exterior, right? But we know that the nervous system really has its root in Yuan Qi and Jing essence, right? I mean, Wei Qi even has its root in Yuan Qi, right? From Ming Men and the kidneys, and then the production of, also additionally from the production of stomach fluids, right? And the separation of the pure and the impure. But so it's really like this combination and communication between the kidney, yin, Jing essence, and its regulation over the central nervous system, which is of course mediated via the movement and circulatory components, the yang aspects of Taiyang, right? So the bladder and small intestine, right? And then from a Zhang Fu perspective, what we're really looking at though is the lung and the liver, right? Because those are the two organs that have that main energetic or resonance to Wei Qi, right? Liver more so towards the muscles and the nerves potentially, and the lung more so in terms of the skin and the pores, right? So from the Zhang Fu perspective, we can look at it as a liver energetic and how it regulates movement of Wei Qi and blood to the sinews and the muscles and the tendons, right? And we know that, like, for example, after a trauma, we see the liver using this protective measure to armor the body, right? So there's been some threat, and so we see, I mean, anytime you see some type of major trauma, the body tends to kind of tighten and recoil, right? And so that's partly a shunting of blood internally to the organ systems, but it's also the liver kind of using what's available to it to protect the exterior and the muscles. It also needs to do that in terms of stimulating, or I should say responding to, the fight or flight mechanism that gets drawn in from the kidney, right? Because that adrenaline needs to get metabolized somewhere. It gets metabolized in the blood, which is stored in the liver. The liver takes that, brings it out to the muscles to allow you to fight, right? Or flee, right? And so it brings it to its regulation of the sinews, which again have that control to the Wei Qi, right? So all this dynamic is happening at the same time. And so from the sinew meridian, we have this mediation of the Shao Yin Taiyang, right? We get protective measures from the heart and pericardium become impacted from the trauma, right? The adrenaline doesn't shut down properly because the threat is constantly perceived, right? So if the person's fire organs or channels, right? So when we're including at the pericardium and the triple burner mechanism, right? And the small intestine too, if their adaptive responses are appropriate, we can bring the body back to a state of homeostasis, right? And regulation. When they're not working properly, we see the adrenaline and the threat is constantly perceived, and the heart goes, the heart rate elevates, we start sweating, and the body can't really calm itself back down, right? So all of these elements are kind of intertwined at the same time when we're talking about the nervous system. And so what we can look at too, when we start to tie this in, so we have the Wei Qi component, we have the Yuan and Jing component, but then if we look at what mediates those things from a channel perspective, that has a lot to do with the divergent meridians, right? And so if we're looking at the bladder channel, it takes Wei Qi, Yuan Qi, it converts it to Wei Qi, it moves it up the Dumai and out towards the source points and into the muscle. The bladder channel has the largest muscle group in the body, right, in terms of its domain, right, over the entire paravertebral muscle at the back. It has its fight or flight muscles in terms of the calves and the hamstrings to get us to run and move, right? And same on the Taiyang small intestine has that same thing in terms of the triceps and the scapula. Those are all the major muscle groups that are helping us to manage an acute threat, right? So this is what Dr. Shen was talking about when he's talking about the faster and lighter moving energies. But they all get their financing from the Yuan Qi level, right? The kidney and the Shaoyin, and then the heart, of course, is the other aspect of that and how it mediates the entire response. So all of that gets converted and metabolized, I guess, in a particular way to allow for nervous system energetics. And back to what you were saying in terms of this tightness in the chest, all Wei Qi homes to the chest, right? That's where it goes, right? And so we start to see things like, from when you start to get the hypervigilance and the armoring, we get tightness and pain. We get it in our back and our shoulders and our necks, but we also get it in our chest. And we also get it in our diaphragm, because the diaphragm is under that regulation of the liver, right, as well. And it tightens up and shuts things down, partly as a response to the liver energetics, but more so because the diaphragm is that piece that allows entry from the chest into the rest of the internal organs, right? So it's really, we can say it's pathological in a sense, but it's more of an ecological aspect to the body preventing entryway and a deeper penetration of pathology into the system, right? So when we get afraid and we're chronically afraid, it becomes this kind of elongated, distorted response, right? But it's always going to impact the movement of the chest into the abdomen. And of course, when we're looking at moving from chest to the abdomen, we're also talking about the energetics of the triple burner mechanism, which in general governs homeostatic behavior for the entire system, right? Which is why it's one of the main things that we see in heart shock is some type of imbalance with the triple burner mechanism, right? So when you start to get that inability of the Wei Qi to internalize, right, from that chronic stress, we see things like insomnia and disturbed sleep and the inability of the body to kind of settle down and relax itself, right? I always give the example to my patients of, when you turn your car on and you're still in park, the car should generally be silent, right? It doesn't make a lot of noise. But sometimes if you're around a car that's not calibrated or an older car, you start to you hear the idling of that car, right? Then, right? That's the rough vibration taking place internally in somebody's nervous system, right? And that's what we're perceiving on the pulse when we're diagnosing like that pathognomonic finding of what heart shock is, right? So their body has not been able to reset, right? And the other part of that vibration is this component of a Yuan Qi Jing level energetic, right? So the body shakes when its core is impacted, right? And so if you're looking to access someone's core energetically with acupuncture, right, you do a vibrating or shaking needle technique, right? That's how we access the 8 extraordinary meridians, right? You don't just needle lung 7 to tap the Renmai. You got to needle that deeply, and then you got to like vibrate the needle and shake it, right? You shake it slowly to stimulate and nourish it, and you go really rapidly if you're trying to dredge something out of it, right? And you do that the same for all the different channels, and same for the divergent meridians. When we're looking at the 3-time needling that's talked about, we go up to the Wei level. Wei level is a more rotating type of circular, right? That's the way Wei Qi moves. And there's also chiseling techniques that access that level too. And then we go down to the Yuan level and we vibrate, and we come back up to the Wei level and we circle if we're trying to release something. If we're trying to bring something into a state of remission and calm it down and quiet the system, then we're going straight to the UN level, and we're doing that vibrating technique slower if we're trying again to strengthen and calm, and then coming up to the top, gathering the Wei Qi, and then driving it back down to the UN level, right? So this is all part of accessing that part of our physiology. And we see this, and I write about this in I think chapter 1 or 2 of my book, but the shaking is one of those really big components that helps us to assess whether or not someone is going to wind up with a heart shock scenario, right? Because if you experience trauma and your body can shake it out, you have a much greater chance of bypassing going into a state of heart shock, where your body can recalibrate and regulate itself and release that tension out of the system. If you can't, it gets buried internally, and you start to get the sequela of that entire process of the revving of the nervous system, the constant leaking and generating of adrenaline, the kidney yang that's constantly being taxed, the heart rate that's being elevated that we talk about, right? And how that constantly is a taxation on heart qi and so forth, right? And there's there's techniques on how to do it for someone. I know like there's yoga techniques. I think something called TRE. Like there's people who do that as part of therapies to help people release some of that. And that's what we're doing in the acupuncture treatment when we're treating heart shock, right? That's what we do with the acupuncture needling portion. The herbs work a little bit differently. But I remember, and I don't know if I write this in my book or not, but when I was 12 years old, I had got an injury and I smashed my entire nose, and the whole thing was like shattered. And I had to go in and have it reconstructed when I was 12. And they wanted to do it in the office. They didn't want to put me out. And so they were putting needles and, shooting needles in through the nose, up into the eye, and trying to like numb things. But they couldn't numb me up, but they decided to keep pursuing the procedure anyway. So it was about a 45-minute procedure where I was just kind of gripping the table and like kind of grunting and bearing the pain of this process. After that was done, they told me to let go of the table, and I proceeded to violently shake. And they left me like that for a while. I was probably like 20 to 30 minutes. I just shook on the table in the doctor's office, all right? And that was the release of all of that shock and trauma kind of coming out of the system. Now, if that was not allowed, would I have suffered some shock from that? Probably, right? And I've clearly suffered from other things before that and after that anyway. But like many of us have, but that's an example of letting that movement kind of work its way out, because the body wants to adapt and the body wants to move towards homeostasis. It just needs to be allowed, right? And oftentimes it's not. And in the book, I talk about all these different like quotes from Peter Levine's book, where he talks about animals on the Serengeti and how this all happens, and they go into these trance states and how they shake, and then as soon as the threat's gone, they kind of get up and go, and they run back into their herd, and they're kind of back on again. Where as humans we don't have that. I guess we're not as in touch with that instinctual part of ourselves, or it's not really cultivated in the same way, right? So we wind up struggling with some of these issues, and then we have a whole nother set of psycho-emotional components that get us in trouble, right? So, but back to what you were saying about the tightness and the pericardium, the pericardium is one of those channels that is really responsible for modulating heart and kidney communication, right? And so it's a crucial component. And one of the things that we notice too, like when we talk about heart and kidney, the heart and kidney channels don't even communicate. Like there's no pathway, on the primary channels at least, right? There is on the sinew channel, the heart, which I talk about a lot in the book. I think that's a really instrumental channel that is not used very often, right? But utilizing the heart sinew channel is so important for regulating heart shock, because it is a direct communication between, and from a Wei Qi level that kind of can tap into the UN level from the heart and kidney. Otherwise, it has to go through the lung, right? And that's one of the reasons why we see a lot of those symptoms in the lung too, and grief and the tightness in the chest and the shortness of breath and all those things. And there's multiple mechanisms that are happening all at the same time, right? You have the liver shutting down the diaphragm. You have the pericardium relationship to the Jue Yin. You have, the heart sinew channel that comes through that area as well. And then the movement into the lung itself and the cardiopulmonary circulation and the regulation of that dynamic as well, right? Because we all know that the regulation of our breath impacts our heart rate, right? And if we're breathing rapidly, that's going to stimulate, right, heart rate. If we can slow our breath down, we can regulate that too. And that's why classically we see so much of a correlation between, the definitions of what's a rapid pulse. It's relative to the breath, right? It's not just an absolute, right? Shen Hammer has different takes on some of these things, and I think they're both very useful, and they're not mutually exclusive. They're both really important, and they tell us very different things, right? But I think that component is really, really key. Anybody else have a comment about that, or another question or something, or topic?
Yeah, Ross. So given the scenario that you just laid out, right, where it was like you were able to perceive multiple things at play, diaphragm, heart, lung, liver, pericardium, Shaoyin, the whole thing, what are the things that are going to lead you to decide, you know what, I need to work with the lungs regulation of rhythm, or I need to work with this aspect, what's going to lead you to go to the heart sinew channel versus anything else, for example?
Well, in that regard, it would be two things. One would be the primacy of symptoms, right? And how the patient is experiencing their symptomatology. And secondly would be looking at the pulse, right? So on top of all the Shen Hammer things that we're looking at on the pulse, I'm also going to look at, from a classical perspective, I'm going to assess the channel system. So I want to see, is the Wei Qi, the primacy, is that, when you feel in the pulse, you get a sense of, well, there's a lot of things going on. We know, right? We're diagnosing 30 different diagnoses off of the Shen Hammer pulse and so forth. But there's always something that seems to draw your attention, right? There's like that thing that says, oh, this is the piece this is like the root, or this is the part I have to address immediately along with the root to allow for me to make change, right? So in the scenario here is I'm turning the wrist over and we're feeling the pulse differently. I'm assessing Wei Qi and the sinew channels, yang sinews, yin sinews, and I'm going to look at the low vessels, and I'm going to look at the divergent channels and see if there's any 8 extraordinary pulses that show up too. And if some of those things catch my attention as being more primal or immediate that needs to be addressed, then I will switch to that channel system, and then from there figure out how to address those things. So if the person's symptoms are showing up with a lot of that like stuffiness in their chest and like tightness and muscular tension, difficulty rotating, and they're having trouble sleeping, and they're having maybe abdominal pain as well, or whatever it is, and shortness of breath and all those things, and I see that that heart sinew channel is showing up really tight and drawing my attention there, and we want to make sure we release it, I'm going to go onto that channel, start palpating and looking at those areas. But as I'm palpating it, I'm also going to be looking for or searching parts of that channel that are going to tie into other symptoms. So, what I always look to on the heart sinew channel is I'll always look to gallbladder 22 as a primary place, because that is going to regulate so many things, and it regulates the yeah and the hormones, which from a divergent perspective, the gallbladder, the small intestine and heart divergent channels implicate. And it's a major Wei Qi point. It's a meeting point, a sinew meeting point, right? So it has so many. It's also was the original great low of the spleen point, right? So when I start looking at points like that and channels like that, I gravitate to the places that have the biggest bang for their buck, right? And then I can work my way through the intercostals and release things. So if I have shortness of breath, tightness in the chest, breathing issues, I could always address those from the heart sinew channel by releasing the intercostals and gallbladder 22, and then moving down the renmi and the kidney channel all the way down to the umbilicus, where it wraps and binds and where it meets the kidney channel too, right? And so then you get kidney grasping lung qi, as well as the heart kidney communication, as well as all the gallbladder dynamics. And if you see something else happening and you've already used gallbladder 22, you could also start now bladder 1. And now all of a sudden you've also tapped into the heart divergent channel at the same time, right? So you start to be able to move fluidly through all those different channel systems and tap into multiple things at the same time without sacrificing specificity, right? And then you can address so many things. Does that make sense? And I would only do that, by the way, if I was trying to do something to release. Like I wouldn't be releasing the Wei level and then, well, I shouldn't say that, because you can do it either way, depending on the order of things. You can release the Wei level and then ground it back into a deep, superficial deep grounding treatment in that same channel if you wanted, right? But it would, if the person had the integrity to release it all, then you can tie it into a superficial, deep, superficial clearing treatment and then actually pull it out, right? And go from there. Jennifer, I see your hand, but you're muted. Let me unmute
Can
you.
you unmute me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. So a lot of us are not practicing our needle work right now with our patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not an herbalist, but I am passionate and I love some of the studies, about the potential for herbal remedies. If I don't even know if this is the platform for it, and I'm sure that your depth of knowledge would go on for another one of these times, like 10,000. But could you talk on some of the herbal preparations that may be valuable in such time as this? Because, we can't necessarily put our needles in our patients. Some of us are, some of us aren't, and some of us are doing a little bit of that.
Yeah,
How
I
do you
don't.
feel about some herbal preps?
Yeah, I mean, a few things with that is I'm reluctant to talk about any particular herbal formula because, like I said at the onset, I don't like creating one-to-one. If you have this, use that. I don't think that's helpful. I think it kind of limits the flexibility and the tailoring of things to your patient as needed. But I think more so what's important is the process of what you're looking at, right? So when you're diagnosing, if you're an herbalist and you have your board certifications and you've studied all this stuff in school, you have a sense already. I don't need to tell you the patterns that go along with different herbal formulas, right? And so you want to look to some of, and I go through a lot of that in I don't know if you have the book, but in each chapter based off of each channel system, I go through representative formulas from the Shen Hammer lineage and from classical perspective and even up from some new, more modern formulas. And I do that with essential oils and all of that too. So my suggestion would be to look to those formulas to satisfy the strategies, right? Because that's the real piece of things that is, I think, often overlooked and probably was the main impetus for me to actually write the book in the first place. Because I think people tend to look at heart shock or a patient coming in, with anxiety and all these different types of chaotic behaviors taking place. And their first inclination is to say, oh, let me just calm them down. Let me give them a calming formula. Let me give them some heavy sedating herbs, or let me open the 4 gates, or, all like these ideas and protocol-ish types of strategies that are not really tailored, right? I mean, they're great ideas, and all of those ideas have their roots and underlying strategies that they're helpful for, but applying them in isolation is problematic, to say the least, right? And can be harmful, right, for people, right? So I spent the whole part 1 of my book detailing what the strategies are in someone with heart shock, right? What the primary, secondary, and tertiary strategies would be and what to look for, and how to combine those strategies together into a cohesive treatment strategy in terms of acupuncture, herbs, essential oils, diet, exercise, supplements, whatever modality you're using is really almost irrelevant in that regard. What's important is really just an understanding of the strategies involved, right? And so if you remember from the book, the main primary strategies were related to the heart, right? Nourishing heart yin, right? Anchoring heart yang. That's what the reason for that elevated heart rate and the speeding up of things. And it's like that runaway train that just can't be taken back under control, right? Calming the nervous system, which again is this whole other big piece that we've talked about, which incorporates all these other channel systems potentially, and Tai-Yang channels, Yin channels, lung liver ideas, all these aspects. And also anchoring kidney yang and strengthening that to consolidate that so yang moves back to its home. And then within those, we had strategies of opening the portals, right? Because that's probably, without a lot of the other things, you don't tend to get a full resolution of heart shock. Because unless you can change the perception of the trauma, you don't move past and through the trauma, right? So what you do is you kind of manage the trauma, and which is fine depending on the patient. Sometimes people aren't willing to allow that to happen, right? So and we have to meet our patients where they are, but you have to, if you're looking for a full resolution, you have to open the portals. That's really the key, is to transcend that trauma and actually use it not to regain who you once were, but to evolve into who you were meant to become, right? Because we're not looking at, and in many ways, that evolution doesn't need to be like it's not a complicated evolution. It's really more of a paring down or a simplification in many ways, right? It's coming to a certain level of clarity about who you are and how to manage your life and and the experiences you've had, rather than being, elevating yourself like, oh, I've overcome trauma. I can see it different, it's a different process, right? And then the other piece, of course, is invigorating the blood, which if there's blood stasis involved, you can't really overcome the trauma. All you can do is kind of compartmentalize the trauma, because our Shen resides and circulates with the blood. So one of the natures of trauma is that it stagnates blood, and it stagnates our memories. It tries to compartmentalize and translocate or put into remission those memories so that we don't have to think about them and experience them. And so invigorating the blood allows for a full resolution and movement, right, and rectification of that traumatic event, right? And that's a really important component, because without that, you're kind of moving along while you have some cancer growing somewhere, right? I mean, and then eventually you're going to be aware of it again, and then it's going to be potentially too powerful, right? And that's in many ways, that's what autoimmunity is, right? I mean, it's like your body is creating latency somewhere because it can't deal with it, and it compartmentalizes it until it overcomes you and then comes back out with a vengeance, right? And then you say, oh, it's my body fighting itself. It's just some autoimmune thing. Like, no, it's not your body fighting itself. It's a translocated pathogen that your Wei Qi has been embroiled with, and it's been like kind of like dampened and held somewhere for a period of time. And that war has been waging all along, right? You're just kind of like sending troops over there to kind of keep it quiet, but eventually it taxes you. And like any war we have, there's casualties involved. And when you suffer enough casualties, your body can no longer maintain something in a state of remission. And then it comes out and starts attacking. In the first place, starts to attack the bowels generally, right, with inflammatory processes and so forth. So it'll hit the Fu organs first, right, and then it starts to move into the Zong organs generally, and that's generally the process, right? And that's, you know, and depending on how it manifests would be using things like the divergent channels or the low vessels, right, as part of those two. I mean, the extras, 8 extras do this too, but those are ways the body holds on to latency, right? Does that make sense? So I'm not trying to skirt the issue of herbs, but basically it really depends, right? So you want to look at the dynamics of all these things and then choose the herbs that are appropriate. So, you know, if you feel like your patient can clear trauma out, then there's strategies for clearing the trauma. If you feel like you need to put this, the person doesn't have the integrity to bring something up and out, right? They don't have the stability to do it. They don't have the lung qi to diffuse and get rid of something, right? Then you need to put something back into a state of latency, and there's herbs and strategies to do that, right? And so that's all detailed, you know, in the various chapters of heart shock. Liz is saying, oh, well, Wu Wei is one of the main herbs we use, right, in the Shen Hammer system. One of the formulas that we like to use or start with, I should say, because we always build the architecture from certain core classical formulas, right? One of them is Shengwai San, and in particular, we tend to use American ginseng instead of Siberian ginseng or Korean ginseng. Because it's more yin nourishing, and as if you remember from a lot of one of the main dynamics that takes place is a rapid diminishment of heart yin and heart blood, because it drives all of that internally when someone experiences the shock, right? It's trying to protect the internal organs, and it does that by driving that energy inward and the blood and the yin inward. And so that's why the yang then starts to float out and escape. And we have this, you know, rapid heart rate and the sweating and the adrenaline rush and all these things, right? All the yang rising signs, right? So Wu Wei is one of those ingredients, right? And then we start to build our formula from there, you know, or you don't need to use Shengwai San as a base, but that's a common, that has been a common strategy that was used in the Shen Hammer lineage. Dr. Shen talked about that a lot. Dr. Hammer uses that all the time. It does wind up in many of my formulas as well, right? Because it just, there's value there, right? Because if you're looking at one of the things you need to do when you have separation of yin and yang, which is what heart shock is, it's a systemic separation of yin and yang, is you need to astringe, right? So you anchor, you nourish, you astringe, right? Those are part of the processes for the heart. And then you, of course, may need to invigorate blood, open the portals, all the things that we've talked about already. But those are core strategies, right? Eugene is another of my favorite for sure. Yeah. Eugene has so many of the, has a lot of value for us because, you know, when we treat heart shock, because it resonates with multiple layers. One, it invigorates the blood, which is one of our strategies. 2, it opens the portals, which is another of our strategies. And 3, it impacts the wood phase, right? And so when we're looking at the wood phase, we're looking at that stuckness, right, all the time, the ability to kind of move and adapt and create that resonance with and flexibility. And so Eugene has that capacity, right? Yeah, and Daniel's saying that, you know, Chai Hu, Jia Long, Muli Tong variations, there's, you know, there's an unending amount of herbs and formulas one can use. It's really about the strategy, right? So once you have your strategies down, and once you can diagnose from your patient which strategies are primary and which are secondary and which are tertiary, then it becomes really a simple calculation of what to do and the priorities and the dosages of the formulas and so forth, right? It doesn't have to be super complicated, right? So, you know, as an example, so I had a patient who came in today. She has been suffering from migraines. She's actually only a 19-year-old girl who's been suffering from migraines since like middle school, since she's had concussion, and she's had multiple concussions. She had one in 8th grade, she had one in 12th grade. And they triggered a whole host of different types of symptoms for her, and migraines were the most problematic. And when I felt her pulse today, it was interesting because, of course, she had rough vibration all over her pulse. But one of the other things that she mentioned in the intake was that she's smoking pot 3 times a day to manage her migraines, right? To help her sleep because she's not sleeping very well, right? And she's also an MMA athlete, and that's actually how she got some of her concussions in the first place, from fighting and cage fighting and doing some of those other things. So, and she's still training every day, right? So one of the things that I want to mention that I find almost without exception is that these types of patients tend to find the exact habitual behaviors that aggravate the diagnoses that they're suffering from, right? It happens all the time, right? So she's someone on her pulse, she has empty pulses over uniform impression. So when I feel pulses, the organ depth is missing on both sides. And then when I go into the actual individual positions, she's empty in the liver and in the stomach, and she has a chaotic pulse in the heart, which changes and goes to absent, right? So some of the worst things she can be doing, right, is engaging in a lot of physical activity, right, and pushing her body, right? She definitely shouldn't be smoking pot, right, because pot wipes out liver yam, right? And she's doing it, as much as she's doing it, right? I mean, no judgment about pot. I think there's usefulness in every herb that we have in our pharmacopoeia, but for her, she's choosing ones that specifically exacerbate her problem, right? So even like if I knew nothing about her and I felt her pulse without talking or knowing anything, I would have 2 questions for her right off the bat. One was, did you have a trauma? And number 2, are you smoking pot? Right? Because she has those signatures right, it's so prominent, right? And so, of course, she's using the pot to manage the symptom. And the symptom is the migraines that's caused by the heart shock and the emptiness in the liver, and how that impact. I mean, number 1, it was the site of trauma, the actual specific site of the trauma. Number 2, the liver governs, a lot of the energetics that go to that area of the body anyway, in the gallbladder channel, right? It's dealing with peripheral blood flow to those tissues and the healing of those tissues, right? So and so we expect to see migraines. It's a common thing that we would look at for someone who experienced concussion, especially more than one. And it makes sense to try and do something to numb that pain from a Western perspective, where you're kind of have symptom A, use B to oppose it. But the problem is, of course, that as she does a treatment, and a self-medicated treatment at that is looking to handle a symptom, it's actually doing it by further aggravating the problem in the first place, which creates a vicious cycle, which means, and what she's been experiencing is that she will need more and more pot to subdue the symptom. And then this cycle will become more and more vicious, where she'll need to keep increasing her dosage of pot to get relief of her migraine and her insomnia, right? Instead of strengthening and boosting the liver, invigorating blood, calming the inflammatory process at what's going on, regulating the heart shock, right? And managing the symptom from the root, right? And then same with the MMA stuff, right? The training is doing all the same types of things. She's elevating her heart rate. So as a resting heart rate, her heart rate was in the mid 80s, and of course, someone her age should be in the mid 70s, right? So and we know that one of the primary impacts of heart shock is to create an elevated heart rate. And so someone whose heart rate is 84 this far, so she's 5, 6, 7 years, or 6 years or so away from the initial trauma. So we know that heart rate after the trauma was probably in the 90s, if not more. And so we see she's going to experience this gradual decline now of her heart rate over time, because she's taxing it from the overwork that it's being put to from the trauma itself that hasn't been managed, and then even worse so from the exercise that she's doing that's going to further tap into her reserves, right? So, having that conversation is always a little bit tricky with someone who is self-medicating and doing and attracted to the specific things that give them the temporary relief, although aggravate their underlying concerns, right? Does that make sense? Is she having liver yang rising symptoms? No, I mean, her pulse was not really elevated above the chi depth, right? And she wasn't experiencing wind. And in fact, she didn't even really have much going on in the neuropsych position. She had very transient kind of sticky pulses that were there, then they would just go away. Like there wasn't a lot of that like thin, tight, hard pounding that you would often see in someone who's experienced concussions, right? So for her, I think, and I think in particular for her, that is because of the pot, right? Because pot will create that like phlegmatic, lymphatic stagnation, right? And I think that's impacting her ability to heal. Some machochocytes to form the Frashak. What are the ingredients in it? Tamara? You can unmute yourself.
All right. Yeah, I wrote it down just before you asked me to check in, offer some questions and so forth. So the ingredients here were listed as Baishao, Wuweitza, Muli, Longer, I'm mispronouncing these, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Hugua, Xuanzao Ren, Shengdi, Renshen, Fuling, Baiji Ren.
Yeah, so this is all like, it has a lot of that astringent anchoring quality to it, right? It's not doing a lot of invigorating blood. It's not really doing a lot for opening the portals necessarily. It's a more anchoring formula, but if it fits the particular presentation, but if your patient, if you're seeing choppy pulses and pulses of other types of stagnation, then you can't just anchor, right? And and in terms of the anchoring strategy, anchoring is really important with heavy minerals, especially when there's floating and empty pulses in the liver, right? So when the liver has that, then it really requires you to add the heavy minerals. So Tag's asking, how do we determine if someone can move through the trauma or it needs to go into latency? Well, this will be a question of stability, right? So how much stability is on their pulse? So if they have empty pulses, all right, then they're not going to be able to move through it. You're just going to create more chaos for them. So they need to have stability and integrity in multiple systems, right? So there shouldn't be empty pulses anywhere. There should be a capacity, a certain strength and integrity in the heart. There should be a certain integrity of the lungs to be able to diffuse to the exterior. Because if you can't diffuse to the exterior, you can't release anything. And there should also be an abundant supply of humors. So, because if you need fluid discharge to really release something properly, right? Some type of fluid. So you need enough blood, you need enough sweat, you need enough tears, enough mucosa, mucus, and all these things to be able to like really discharge something like you would, right? And that's important. Because if you bring something up to the surface without the integrity to discharge, then you're creating stagnation and then the potential for auto-intoxication and really chaos on a physical level, but also on a mental, emotional, and psychological level too. Right? You could easily bring someone into like a psychotic state if you're bringing all their traumas up and making them relive something that they're not able to handle. You gotta be really careful about that, right? Let's see. Any other questions? You can just unmute yourself and ask it.
So in that instance you just gave, how would you would you go back and forth to try and help them to regulate so they're not induced into that psychotic state?
Well, I'd have to look at every piece of that puzzle, right? And go and look at the pulse. I have to see which areas are unstable and so forth, and put together a whole strategy. So, when I manage someone's someone's case is the first thing I'm doing on someone is we have our conversations and or pulse. Sometimes I'll do the pulse first, sometimes I'll talk first, depending. But after I meet with that person for the hour and whatever, I break down their diagnoses for them so they understand what's going on, right? So they can see all the different disparate elements that are managed, that are coming together to create their symptom presentation and the real root of what's going on, right? Because the root's the key. And then so after that, once they leave, I don't usually treat on the first day. On the first day, I usually have them come back because I like to work up the chart. I spend another period of time working all the diagnoses, and then I work through a list of priorities. And so what I do at that point is I create an outline where I have my immediate interventions. And so those are things like stability problems, like empty pulses and heart shock and chi wild and other things, and then I have that's under like Roman numeral 1A, and then I have 1B, which is things like immediate issues like circulatory problems, pathogenic influences that are there. So maybe there's toxicity or systemic blood stagnation, or there's wind, heat, and wave, whatever it is, like there's something there. And then Roman numeral 2 is my root issues, right? So anything that's not included in 1, so things like underlying yin essence deficiency or kidney deficiency or the real underlying root problems. And then I'll go into Roman numeral 3, which is my secondary issues, which could be things like blood heat or gallbladder inflammation or whatever it is. And then as I move through, and once I have that outline in front of me, I create my treatment strategies, right? So my treatment strategies need to incorporate my immediate concerns and my root issues. That's the target of what I'm treating. But to do that, I have to incorporate everything in Roman numeral 3 and 4 too. So for example, if I want to treat someone's heart shock who's experiencing anxiety, insomnia, and so forth, but they're having esophageal stagnation, I can't just give them a formula to treat insomnia and anxiety and heart shock without opening up the esophageal stagnation so they can properly digest my formula and allow for proper communication and assimilation of it, right? So every single thing you find on someone's pulse, every diagnosis that you have needs to be accommodated into your ultimate treatment. Because if it's not, you run the risk of doing just what Western doctors do, which would be saying, oh, you have anxiety, or insomnia, take an Ambien. And then you get side effects, or it doesn't work properly, or you can fall asleep a little bit, but you don't feel rested in the morning, or a million things that can happen as a consequence, right? So as a Chinese medicine practitioner, we have access to so much more information than that, and we need to utilize all those pieces in crafting the treatment, right? So we list our diagnoses, we prioritize our diagnoses in an outline, we create our strategies, and we incorporate all those elements into the treatments in terms of a management plan, right? So that's kind of how it all comes to fruition, right? And then if there's anything that, is not working properly, or if there's a symptom or something that's not being addressed, you can see exactly where it is. Maybe your priority wasn't proper, your ratio and your the way you prioritize your dosages and wasn't sufficient enough, and you needed to put a little more emphasis and weight on the anchoring or the nourishing or the whatever it is, and you have a way of going back and checking yourself, right? Because it's all great in theory, but if it doesn't work out clinically, then it's it's not so helpful anyway, right? So everything we're doing is always kind of like a hypothesis that needs to be clinically verified, right? You'd like to see some examples. Yeah, I mean, like I have whole webinars where I teach how to create that outline. I have those on my website, I think, but I think to do that, it's really first probably important to get some more foundation in the entire Shenhammer system and pulse and the classical pulse and some of those things too, because they're all reliant on some other background information, but we can definitely do that. Let me just see some of these things in the chat. Do you list their symptoms for their benefit or yours? I don't list their symptoms. I mean, I'm writing notes down when they talk, but I don't write their symptoms down when I'm going through. I mean, I'm looking at their symptoms and I'm explaining and understanding their symptoms based off of all the energetics of what I see on the pulse, but I'm not having to write that down again and duplicate any of that. Ross did this with a patient on the second. Oh, right. Yeah. We did that in Maryland, right, Tracy? And we kind of went through a case and mapped out the different priorities and strategies from there, because I think it's so easy to skip over those things, See, my thing is, like, I find that these are things that we learn in like OM1, right? And I think when people go into the clinic and all of a sudden they just drop out some of these basic foundational things. And I don't think anything I'm saying here is so mind blowing, right? It's just like, it's going back to basics. It's looking at all of those things and building the foundation from the beginning. Because if you're treating without the foundation, then you're really just kind of cherry picking, right? You can, I got this symptom, I know this herb tends to work really well for that symptom. And I really don't think that's so different than what Western medicine does. And, I don't have a lot of faith in that model, right? I think it's a lot of, I think it's what has become of many of our institutions these days in terms of teaching and TCM and the westernization of a lot of this information. But I think we always have to go back to process. It's all about the process. It's all about the mechanisms, the movement, the gestures, and the directionality of the symptoms and what they're signifying and how it relates to the whole. Because without that information, you really are just kind of cherry picking. And when you try and address one thing without an understanding of the whole, you influence the whole anyway, but you do it in a way that has potential for harm, right? Yeah, what Tracy's saying is in the chat is that sometimes you get so much information from the pulse that it can be overwhelming, right? And sometimes we do just kind of, the tendency in our nature is when we are overwhelmed is to pick the thing that's most obvious, right? But the problem is that, the good thing is that sometimes the most obvious things are the biggest things, right? The most important things. But there's also tremendous amount of, for anyone who studied the Shenhammer pulse with me or other people, that the amount of subtlety within the vessels is immense. Right. It's really, I think, exponentially infinite. Right? I don't think we've tapped into a very small percentage of what that is. And if you look at TCM, you have 28 pulses, in Shenhammer, we have over 90 different pulse sensations. Right. So it's a lot of complexity and a lot of subtlety to pick out all these things, but they become so important clinically that I think, I wouldn't want to just rely on one thing and not see the grander picture of things, right? Because then you run the risk of, I think, bringing all this back to what we were talking about earlier, the wood phase, right? Then you lose the real virtue of what the wood phase provides us, which is a vision, but not just this tunnel vision forward. The gallbladder gives us this ability for rotational movement, right? It allows us to look this way. It allows us to look that way, right? And up and down. And so by that, I mean, we get to see a grand, large picture. We don't get focused on one thing that's so small. And I think if you look at what Chinese medicine offers in general, is it offers us a view of the landscape. Right? So look at Chinese art and pictures, right? You generally see big, grand landscape. You don't just see like a detail of one leaf, right? That's Western medicine, right? I think in Chinese medicine, we do have the capacity, and I think that's what the pulse allows you to do, is both. It allows you to see that grander landscape picture, the whole forest, but it allows you to like pierce in very, very, very pointedly to the smallest detail on the leaf of a tree, and so we do that in many ways. So on the pulse, we have these, overall picture on the pulse, and we have our fingers on both wrists at the same time, and we're seeing the uniform qualities and the different depths. But then we go into each individual position, and we have 28 different pulse positions in the Shen-Hammer pulse, right? Not just 6 positions, right? So it's not just what's happening here and there. We're going in and rolling our fingers and what's happening in the lung, but what's happening in the left lateral lobe of the left lung, right? I mean, it's like you can get so much specificity. And so, but you don't want to get the specificity and just treat the specificity without understanding the grander picture, because then you don't really know what else you're influencing and whether or not someone is even able to assimilate and make any use of that treatment, right? So you need both pieces. And I think that's where we can really shine, but we have to do it by creating, the strategies for our treatments and not just cherry pick the one symptom and, and feel like, because I think it's easy, right? And it's easy to even get caught up in building a business that way, because you can do it and you can probably do it in the community, and someone comes in with shoulder pain and you put some needles in and their shoulder pain goes away, and they tell a friend and they tell a friend, and, and next thing you got like some huge practice treating shoulder pain. But are you healing in them? Are you bringing, it's like, I don't know. It's never something that interested me. Like, of course I want to get rid of people's shoulder pain, but I want to do it in context, right? I want them to understand where the shoulder pain came from and how to manage it and how to not have it come back again, and how to live appropriately and moderately so that they're not, tapping into reserves that create other health issues. Or if I'm treating their shoulder pain, but on their pulse, I'm finding that they've got, a tumor in their gallbladder, I want to tell them that. I want them to know, right? Or if there's a breast cancer involved, I see that all the time with people, right? You pick up things on the pulse that they have no idea about. People, they don't know what's happening inside their own bodies. Most people aren't in touch with that level of information, right? So I think that's so important. One of the things that I remember, Jeffrey Ewan talked about a lot when he was teaching pulse diagnosis years ago was, he would talk about the 4 pillars of diagnostics that we engage in, right? When we speak to our patient and when we're looking and observing, we see what they're showing us, right? They came out, they combed their hair and they put on makeup or whatever they did. And then they're speaking to us and we're hearing their voice and certain qualities about how they express themselves. But then we ask them questions, right? And those questions are things like, what are your bowel movements like, right? What's your menstrual cycle? These are things that people don't normally tell other people, right? So this is kind of the level more of like that they suppress, right? So there's more active things they're expressing, right? In their speech and so forth. And then the thing they suppress, they don't tell people because it's really personal. But then you touch their pulse and you go into their pulse, and now you're finding things at the level of repression, right? Things that they might not even know about themselves, right? And so that's really a valuable tool to be able to utilize within the entire framework of how you're diagnosing this person and how you're recommending and managing them over time and educating them, really, right? Because that's what we're here to do. So, anyone else have?
Yeah, Ross, this is Brian. I have a quick question on that point you were just addressing. Do you find that you do a lot of interplay between asking questions of your patient and spend maybe a little bit more time on the pulses? For one thing, I don't know how long you spend pulling pulses.
Right, so on the initial visit, I spend roughly 25 to 30 minutes, depending on the complexity of the patient.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And in that, I have a whole pulse record, which let me clear this. You probably can't read it anyway, but the person's name. But so it's a whole pulse record that I fill out, which incorporates all the Shen-Hammer information as well as classical pulse information from other lineages in terms of the sinew channels, diversion channels, low vessels, and directionality, and is the lung diffusing qi, is the heart communicating to the kidney, is the spleen ascending to the lung, and all those kinds of things. And so I create that whole mapping on my first visit. And then from there, I use that to express to the patient all the different diagnoses that I'm seeing and how it ties into all their symptoms. And then after they leave, then I kind of work up the rest of it on, my outline that I already described to you. Yeah.
Okay, great.
And usually during the time where I'm feeling the pulse, they're quiet. I mean, I do ask some questions while I'm feeling the pulse, but we're not engaging in a major dialogue unless I'm trying to elicit something.
Right. Otherwise, it's obstructive. Yeah.
Yeah, because if I want to see, for example, if someone, for example, if their lungs are not diffusing, right? So if they're not able to diffuse their lung qi out to the exterior, can I see if asking them certain questions triggers that energetic to happen, right? So the lungs deal with, the metal phase deals a lot with, judgment and right and wrong and like these kind of really deep kind of intrinsic questions to belief systems, right? So if I'm engaging with this patient and I start asking them things that might get them a little, into that realm of judgment where they may be thinking this is right, this is wrong, oh no, they shouldn't be doing that, or, that piece
Right.
of them. And then as I'm feeling for this dynamic to see if I can engender that, right? So if I can engender it, then there's a lot, it's an easier fix, right? It won't take as long to rectify something like that than if it's coming from a real strong deficiency where their body just doesn't have the capacity to do it.
Right.
Right.
That's
So-
that's excellent. That's exactly what I was wondering.
Yeah. And similarly, when you're feeling someone's pulse, if say they have a rapid heart rate, all right, and you're feeling their pulse, and now it's a very meditative kind of experience when you're feeling pulse for 25 minutes or so, right? So can you see if you can control the rate on their pulse, right? By giving that like impression and the intention to slow their pulse down. And oftentimes it will, and sometimes it won't. When it does, again, it's something that tends to be more functional than organic. I would not expect to be able to, someone who's just came off of like a really severe trauma to be able to have that influence, right? But someone who is generally not experiencing rapid pulse, but only experiences it when they're really upset and anxious, by trying to do that and trying to initiate that calming process from your own presence, sometimes you get that, right? And that's those people tend to feel immediate relief after. And they'll get off the table and feel, I feel so much better right now. I feel where the other person's like, no, 4 or 5 treatments, and they're like, oh, okay, now I'm starting to feel a little change, or it helps you also to assess, because everyone wants to know, right? How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? Right? So these are things that also help you to create your treatment schedule and say, well, I want to see you twice a week for a month and then once a week for a few months after that, because that's kind of my assessment of what it's going to take to get you to feeling better. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Anybody else? I know I kept you guys a long time. It's 8:30 already. Time flies. But if anyone else has another question, I'm happy to take it. Otherwise, we can move to, I'm happy to also do these more often. I would love to try and create something where we actually go, today was more just kind of riffing and going through just whatever we wanted to talk about. But if we wanted to create something where we move, for example, through the book in a particular order, I would love to do that with you guys. And we can kind of, have a particular pages to be read, and then let's go and discuss. Because I don't want to be lecturing, and you can get a lot of this information in the book too, right? But I want to clarify it and elucidate it, and bring, contextualize it, and kind of bring it a little more to life and make it less dry than just reading a book. Yeah. Liz, you had a question?
I'm not sure if I even want to ask my question. I'm thinking about it.
Okay.
I guess, I've been a nurse for 20 years, and I'm an acupuncturist now. So I do a lot of bridging between Western medicine and Chinese medicine, especially related to the neuroendocrine system. And because heart shock to me is loosely related to PTSD, that sort of thing. There's a lot of information out there regarding the neuroendocrine system, Tai, Yang, Xiao Yin, Jue Yin, when you start to look at it, when you start to bridge those informations. I think it's important for people to remember that a lot of our neuroendocrine system, it starts in the small intestine, which is Tai Yang, and then, the brain being part of Tai Yang, bladder channel, and all that. And so I just think it would be good for people to, when they have time, to look at the hormones that play into PTSD. It's this sequelae of events that happens in different parts of the brain, and all those can be tied into, like I said, Tai Yang, Xiao Yin, Jue Yin.
Right.
And
When
so,
you're looking at hormones, you're also looking at the Yi, right? The thick fluids,
right.
right? And so when we're looking at the Yi, we're looking at the small intestine and heart divergent channel too, right? And that's a big piece of what those channels offer, and why the heart small intestine confluence is really a major go-to for heart shock patients.
Yeah.
It's funny because it's interesting, and I see a lot of fertility patients too, right? And treating heart, small intestine, divergent channel, or heart kidney, and a lot of these same heart shock strategies rectify those hormonal problems, and the patients get pregnant very quickly. It's a really interesting thing because the tie-in, it's the energetics are the same, right? And oftentimes a lot of these fertility patients have had experiences of trauma. How many women, have had, traumatic experiences in terms of sexual abuse and other types of abuse is staggering, right? I mean, it's from my experience, so much higher than the percentages that are reported, right? And oftentimes women are so conditioned to not even thinking that some of the things that have happened to them have been traumatic, which is really interesting because there's a whole conditioning of things, and the inability to kind of like just take things as they are, or, accepting that just that's the way things in life are, and the dynamics between men and women and so forth. And so, it can be really, really powerful using these heart shock ideas and strategies for our fertility patients and for all the hormonal insufficiencies.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Donna. For sure.
In that same line, Ross, when you sense it in the TCM perspective, and you feel it in their pulse, and you're aware that there's some sort of underlying trauma that the woman might not be aware of, how do you kind of broach that or go around that?
I'm always addressing trauma when I, in my evaluations, because when you start to practice the Shenhammer pulse, you start to perceive trauma, right? It's just, you become so attuned to perceiving it. And it's a conversation that I have. So I have a 7-page intake that someone fills in before they come to see me. And a lot of those, 4 of those pages are early life history and trauma experiences. So I have them thinking about these things before they even come see me. And I would say that, and I'm being very conservative here, at least 75% of my patients have rough vibrations or some aspect of trauma being evidenced on their pulse, right? It doesn't mean that it's all impacting them in this PTSD sort of way, but there's elements. And so I'm always bringing that up in my evaluations and in part of our discussions with patients, and not in a very confronting sort of way, in a very safe kind of inquiring sort of way, not pressing, right? You can't press someone about if they're not ready to talk about their traumas. In fact, there's plenty of people who just have said, just if I start talking about it, they say, I can't talk about this. And I say, okay, I don't need them to talk about it to treat it, to understand it. But for those people, we have to be very mindful that we want to treat them in ways that do not involve yin qi, right, blood. You don't want to bring it up. So that's one of the virtues of the divergent channels, because the divergent channels deal with wei and yin, right? So it's bypassing the yin level. So we don't have to bring that up into their psyche, into their emotional narrative. We can work with it in different ways, and maybe putting it into a state of latency to start, or then working together to kind of bring out in a safe way. So because even sometimes there are possibilities even when you're putting something into a state of latency, that when you strengthen someone enough, sometimes the body will try and clear on its own, right? And so and vice versa. When you try and clear something first, the body will do that and then try and anchor itself, right? So those are strategies that we actually use with divergent channels a lot. But so sometimes we have to let our patients know that if something comes, if things come up and you're not comfortable, you got to let me know, because we need to, create that latent condition, right?
Yeah.
Bring that into a more suppressed or repressed place for the time being until they're able to handle it and manage it, right? Because you never want to bring something up where someone is incapable of handling what's in front of them, right? Because that can be really, really difficult. I have had that happen early in my career, and it's a horrible experience. It's a horrible experience to be on the side of it that kind of engendered it too. It's just not. You start to figure out you need to kind of manage that very quickly, because it wasn't an intention, and sometimes it can happen. It happens sometimes in the form of dreams. It can happen in the forms of spontaneous memories coming through, right? That people can't. Then they get trapped in their narrative, where they start replaying it. So it can be really, really tough. All right. Anybody else? Last chance.
Can I ask a question that's switching gears a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
I'm curious if you are treating patients remotely at all, from where you are, and other than just herbal consults, if you're doing any kind of Taoist practices for your patients, or energetic practices directed towards treating patients right now.
I do have a few people that I treat remotely. I mean, during this time now, I have patients of mine who I'm meeting over Zoom, and where, I know them already, so it's a little bit easier to manage them. You can inspect tongue over Zoom and all those other things, and especially because I already have baseline. But I am seeing a few new people too over Zoom, which is less comfortable for me, because I'm so much a believer in feeling their pulse. It's part of what I've been doing for 20 years, and it's kind of really how it all ties together for me. But in the absence of being able to do that, yeah. So in terms of the Taoist stuff, there's not just me, but 2 other people on this call right now who are doing that as well, right? So Josh is here on the call, and Sandino is here too, and so we all do that as well, in terms of meeting with patients remotely and sending talismans or so forth. So yeah. I don't know if Sandino or Josh wants to speak to that at all. Not to put you guys on the spot, but I am.
Feel free to talk about your talismans that you're creating and sharing.
Josh, Sandino, do you want to? I'm talking a lot. My mouth's getting dry.
You need a drink of water or wine.
I have one right here.
Well,
No, but there are different things that we do for that, and I think I think that's something better left for private communications, probably, than doing it in this type of platform. Yeah. And so feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to reach out to Josh. Feel free to reach out to Sandino. For those, because I think I think there's tremendous usefulness for heart shock specifically, and for many other things as well.
Can I share something kind of just simplistic and silly?
Yeah.
Unrelated to talisman, but so we're talking a lot about deeper stored trauma, and then we're also talking about ways to prevent storing this trauma. And with needling, the vibration of the needling and the TRE and other practices like that. So I think one of the helpful things that we can remind our patients is that laughter is another big way to prevent this. And I happen to be chatting with, I have a renter in my basement, and she usually goes to bed really early, like 9 o'clock. She's up early. She volunteers all over the place. She gets her grandkids to school. She does a ton of stuff. She's not doing that right now. And I've been hearing her down there just laughing her butt off until like 10:30. And I asked her what the heck she's been watching. And she said that she's been sleeping so much better. She normally has trouble sleeping. And with the laughter before bed, she's sleeping amazingly and she feels great. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. It's funny because that brings me to one of the quotes, one of the main quotes I have in my book, which is the I Ching chapter 51, right? Which it talks about the thunder section, where after the thunder comes and they kind of shake and shiver, and then they whoop it up with laughter at the end, right? That's kind of the translation, one of the translations. And I think, that when you come through that when you come through and get that ability for that nervous system to reset, right? And for something to kind of shake you into a different place than where you were. It is almost like that ability for the nervous system to discharge. And part of that discharge really is the heart being able to emanate and take its place back as emperor. Right? And so when it takes that back, it is incredibly joyful, right? It should have that kind of sense of lightheartedness and laughter that comes along with it. So that's awesome. Thank you for mentioning that. Howard, you had a question? No, you got the hand up on your. Oh, okay. No worries. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if anyone else, you just jump in if you have something to say, but I just want to thank you guys all for coming. It's been, almost 2 hours now, and we had like 50 people in the room, and that was kind of fun to see all your faces alive and well. I would love to do this again. I will probably send out another email maybe for another date. I'll probably post some stuff up on Facebook again for the next session. And if you have suggestions about what that looks like, that'd be great. But otherwise, my suggestion would be maybe we kind of start with the beginning of the book and try and work through the whole process and then move into the channel systems and talk about the acupuncture and the herbs and all those other things.
Beautiful. Perfect.
Awesome. All right. So before I shut the room down, someone mentioned to me, was it Brian, about ending the recording without losing it?
Yeah, you basically just leave all the screens, right? So you'll hit down in your bottom right, you'll hit end the meeting, right? And then you'll have maybe a stack of 2 or 3 white screens. Just let them stay there.
Okay, so I can end the meeting and leave the room.
No, you can end the meeting. Just let the screen collapse after you click on end the meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
And then you'll have basically 2 or 3 reduced frame screens sitting there. And the topmost one that pops up, it says it's going to start downloading the files.
Cool.
And you'll see a little progress bar go from left to right.
Awesome.
Okay? And then somewhere in your computer, you're going to have a Zoom folder. It might be in files or documents. It's on documents in my PC-based system. Documents, and then there's a Zoom folder. You click that open, and you'll see tonight's session, and you'll have 3 files. You'll have an MP3 audio only, and then you'll have 2 other ones, which are video.
Okay, cool.
Okay?
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah.
educational.
Good job,
Was,
Brian.
right? Yeah, totally.
Good job, Brian.
All right. Well,
love you,
thank you guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Russ.
Thank you.
See you guys soon.
Thanks,
Have a good
Rob.
night.
Russ. We won't leave till you do.
All right. I'm just stopping the recording.